Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome ethologist, author, and department chair for animal studies with Humane Society University, Dr. Jonathan Balcombe.
Can everybody hear me? Clearly you can. It's working. Great. I have a mic here so I can move around a little bit. I'm an ethologist. That's somebody who studies animal behavior, and ethologists like to kind of integrate themselves with animals and think the way they do, and part of doing that is being like the animal and behaving like the animal. And I also really appreciate the grass, and it really kind of, to go with the grass, I've actually made a request that a fire hydrant be brought up for my talk. Let me get right on with my talk then. The roots of our relationship with animals date back at least 23 centuries to the time of Aristotle, whose idea of the scala naturae, the natural scale, placed humans above all the other animals, although below God and the angels. In the 17th century, René Descartes further diminished animal status by arguing that they, not us, but they, were thoughtless automatons, having no feelings and therefore of no moral consequence. And to this day, these ideas are very influential because animals are legally and universally defined as the property of humans. We kill a lot of animals today, about 60 billion terrestrial animals, and by some estimates, 1 trillion or more fishes each year. And we kill most of them to eat them. However, hundreds of millions are also killed for fashion, science, and recreation. And we might think of this as sort of a might makes right kind of way of thinking. This is a sort of, and the roots of the might makes right way of thinking in our attitude towards animals are quite rich. They include colonialism, the slave trade, the subjugation of women's rights, and the denial of civil rights. So we see these patterns of narrow thinking in our past. Since the 20th century, though, a number of civilizing processes that the psychologist Steven Pinker has written about in his influential, and I recommend his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Human Violence has Declined. A number of civilizing principles he points out to try to help explain why we've moved on from some of those past social ills and relegated them to the history books. And these include statehood, feminization, the empowerment of women, the rise of international commerce, where another country which might have at one time been more valuable to our country for, say, one's own country, say for people that we could exploit, go and take over their country and get their resources. Now we think of them as trading partners. Literacy, the rise of people understanding language and being able to acquire information. Cosmopolitanism, the fact we're in a global community. The internet is a big part of that. The exchange of information. And the rise of reason, which is concomitant from these other things. And at the same time, we really have an unprecedented awareness and concern for animals and their capacities. And we can thank people like Charles Darwin, and more contemporarily, I'm blanking on his name, that's a bit embarrassing, but another scientist, for bringing us to this, and in fact, he was the guy who discovered that bats echolocate in the 1930s. So I studied bats, so he's really important to me. But I'm just blanking on his name. Sorry, man. And at the same time, philosophers such as Peter Singer and Tom Reagan have done a great deal to advance our thinking, our moral thinking about animals. And then there are some biologists who are just so famous they don't really need any introduction. You don't recognize them? Okay, never mind. So it's a very exciting time to be an ethologist because science is bringing to light some quite remarkable aspects of animals, what animals are thinking and what they are feeling. And so in the rest of my 4-hour lecture, I would just like to go through some examples of these. I can summarize a recent study of starlings in 4 words. Caged birds become pessimistic. And when I read that there's a study showing that birds can be pessimistic, they can have a dim view of life, I was really taken by that. And another study followed up showing that birds with rich living environments, they're not living in cages, they actually have a good social life and lots of different food, they have more optimistic outlook. And this reflects our own experience in life. People who are depressed are much less likely to try something with an uncertain outcome than people who are feeling happy about life. Pessimism versus optimism. Rats have metacognition, another study that showed that rats can be confident about what they know, or they can be doubtful about what they know. I don't have time to describe the clever way that study was designed. I describe it in one of my books, Second Nature. But it's a kind of question that scientists weren't asking through much of the 20th century. Reptiles, we think of them as cold-blooded, instinct-driven animals. There's a recent paper study published just 2 months ago about play in reptiles. And a colleague of mine, a guy named Vladimir Dinitz at the University of Tennessee, spent 6 years traveling all around the world studying crocodilian behavior, watching them from trees and watching them from the side of rivers carefully and such, and documented things like some of them climb trees, actually, so maybe he wasn't safe watching them from a tree. Coordinated hunting, cooperative hunting, and tool use, as we see here in this picture. In some areas, both in North America and the east, I should say. East-west is a little tricky when you're on stage. Crocodiles will actually float sticks on their snouts and swim underneath heron rookeries and then sink under the water, so the sticks are floating up there. The herons, there's a real premium on sticks to build their nests. You can probably complete the rest of the story. The herons fly down to get the sticks, and then they get ambushed by the crocodile. Actually, you can probably see some feathers in the background from some unfortunate egret. This is very sophisticated tool use. It is both time and location sensitive, because they only do this during the breeding season of the herons, and obviously the herons aren't nesting everywhere. They have to take those sticks to the areas where the herons are. That's pretty complicated behavior, not the kind of thing we've in the past been associating with this cold-blooded reptile, which actually cold-blooded is a bit misleading. Their body temperatures rise according to the temperature outside. That's why they sun themselves to bring their temperature up. So they're actually operating at warm temperatures most of the time, warm blood. I'm sorry? Poikilothermic, thank you. There's always a jargon person in the audience. If I don't give the jargon, someone else is going to do it. Thank you very much, actually. Fishes also use tools. Maybe not all fish, although we're not really living under the water, so we're probably missing a great deal. But fishes like parrotfishes and trunkfishes have been now documented, and you can watch YouTube videos blowing water on the sand to uncover, say, a clam, and carrying that clam to a specific rock, which the fish uses as an anvil to smack the clam against to get at the soft inner tissues to feed. So it's planning and tool use in a fish. They don't have hands, so you're not going to find the same kind of tool use that we might have, but they can do quite a lot with their brains and their mouths, for instance. And just a little plug for my next book, What a Fish Knows. It's about time we had a book of fish advocacy. I mentioned how many we kill a little earlier. And the science of fish cognition, emotion, and behavior is really advancing in a very exciting way. So I'm actually working on a book right now that's due out next year, which will bring to light this emerging science of a group of animals that we've been really thinking in a rather dim way up until now. And animals are flexible. And with the advancement of technology such as camera traps, and we've already seen some examples of that at this meeting last night, Joel Sartori's talking about for instance, the pronghorn going under the fence. We saw that the camera traps he's been using, and the camera that moves around, etc. Camera traps in Africa found that these small felines, genets, that they actually hitchhike on the backs. Some of them hitchhike on the backs of rhinos and water buffaloes. Flexible behavior. Here's a big animal that can carry me safely around at night. Mind you, I have to go where he or she's going, but the benefits clearly outweigh the costs, so they do it. And a little plug for a project at my professional job, my other professional job when I'm not speaking, Animal Sentience, a new journal on animal feeling. This is the first journal of its kind, and we're launching this journal. This website is live, but we haven't really made an announcement yet because we're just getting the contents ready. But I'm very excited about this journal. So science is now into the study of animal feelings, and it's about time, really. So let me go through some animal feelings for you. A few examples of animal emotion. Hands up if you've lived or currently live with a cat or a dog. Okay, not surprisingly, almost every hand is up. I should have put mine up as well. Just a little story. Following a visit to the vet, one of my cats, Micah here, was so traumatized that he went upstairs for 40 hours on a hunger strike and didn't come down to eat. That's how intense his emotions were. He was not the one who'd been to the vet. It was actually his sister, Megan. So it just says something about the power of emotional osmosis, that one cat can be so flipped out by another cat having had a traumatic experience. As you know, if you've lived with cats, they hate change. Having been to the vet, it freaked him out. But scientific studies also show that dogs, for instance, are able to read the emotions of other dogs based on the tail wag. If the tail is wagging more to the left, I guess it's from your perspective, it's that way, and the dog is a little stressed and uncertain about things. If the tail's wagging more to the right, the dog's feeling happier and more relaxed. Maybe like the starlings, who are more or less optimistic or pessimistic. And studies at the Clever Dog Lab in Vienna, Austria, we visited this lab last summer, also have trained dogs to put their heads on this little platform here, and then they have cameras that can detect eye movement. And by doing that, they've discovered that dogs look at faces in a manner that we do too. We do it subconsciously, but when we look at another human face, we glance left. We typically glance left first, just for maybe a tenth of a second. And we're not aware we're doing it, but by doing that, we're reading more emotions on the other face, because the left side of our face conveys more emotion. Or actually, it's the right side of our face, but we're glancing left. You know what I mean. And dogs do that as well when they look at us. Dogs do not do that when they glance at a dog's face. Why? Because dogs' faces, although dogs are certainly emotional, they don't convey that emotional valence from right to left. So they're doing what we do. And it's useful for them. It's useful for us. Why do we do that? Well, we get a little more information about how the other person is feeling. And that's useful for us, so we can gauge our behavior accordingly. And similarly for the dogs who've been living with us and to some degree manipulating us for about 15,000 years or so. When they glance at a shoe, as the picture on the right, they don't do any of that left-right glancing. They don't glance left first. Shoes don't convey emotion anyway. And that's an example of a control in a study like this, where you see that it's not universal. They're doing it specifically at other human faces and not at shoes, for instance. Studies at Emory University. Donald Griffin, by the way, his name just popped into my mind. Donald Griffin, I want to give him credit. The guy who studied echolocation in bats. Whew. It's scary when you forget some name like that. Charles Darwin, at least I remembered. Greg Burns, a current scientist at Emory University, has been training dogs to relax. These are companion animal dogs. These are people's pets. They're happy dogs, socialized dogs, and training them to sit still in an fMRI machine. This is a machine that measures brain activity in a live way. So the brain is actually actively changing, and you can measure the energy in the brain and get a feel for what kind of emotions the animal may be feeling. By comparing it to our own brains, we can voluntarily stay still in an fMRI machine, and we can read that when we're feeling happy or excited about something, or we see a picture of someone's face who we love, different areas of our brain light up. And lo and behold, the same sorts of areas are lighting up in dogs when, for instance, they see their human guardian. And the human guardian, the quote-unquote owner of the dog, seems to bring the most positive affect in the dog's brain. Perhaps not surprisingly, but even more so than one of the dog's canine friends or another familiar human. It's the one they live with who they seem to love the most. So, man as a dog's best friend counts as well as a dog as a man's best friend. Or woman, of course. I've done a great deal studying animal pleasure, and I want to talk a bit about animal pleasure, partly because I have some slides, but also because the talk is about animal pleasure, so I didn't want to neglect that. I hastily changed my title before this talk. Sometimes you forget what you submitted. So here's a couple of books about animal pleasure. I'm proud to say these are the first books to address this rather important phenomenon. There's so much on pain and suffering in animals, and there should be. That's very important. But let's look at the other side of life, the optimism versus the pessimism. And science really neglected that until quite recently, and that's changing. And for instance, earlier this year, Current Biology, a great journal, online journal, had a whole issue on the biology of fun, animals' capacity to feel fun. That would have been unheard of just 20, 30 years ago for a scholarly journal to talk about animal fun. When scientists take their white coats off and go to the bar and have some beer, they might talk about it, but not in the lab. That was a taboo subject, animal emotion, animal feelings. That's changed. Exciting time to be an ethologist. The way I like to frame pleasure is to put it against pain. So pain is nature's way, It's a very adaptive behavior, a very adaptive phenomenon. Pain is nature's way of punishing maladaptive behavior, behaviors that risk loss of life or limb injury, and removing yourself from the gene pool. If you've ever read any of those Darwin Award books, you'll know that some people are quite creative about coming up with ways of removing themselves from the gene pool. And the flip side is that pleasure is nature's way of rewarding good behavior, behaviors that promote survival and reproduction. And some behaviors are quite clearly pleasurable for animals if you just use our empathic abilities and look at them and see how they respond. Clementine, a little runty piglet here on a farm in Michigan, was clearly very pleased to have that bottle of food. And we can relate to that. We love food. Everybody's probably having a good time in here because despite having to listen to me, you're actually eating lunch as well. Plants invest a great deal in and sort of manipulate animals according to their capacity for pleasure. Fruit is a beautiful co-evolutionary strategy that plants do to get their seeds to move their seeds somewhere else. If a seed drops below a plant, the parent plant, it's going to struggle to grow. Why? Because it's competing for light, water, and nutrients. But if you can get those seeds elsewhere, and I'm not suggesting the plants are thinking about this, there's no evidence that plants are cognitive, but they are products of evolution by natural selection, and if it works over time, they're going to tend to drift that way in how they function. And so fruit attracts animals to eat the fruit. And how does it do that? Well, bright colors, a nice smell, a delicious taste, and a big, huge nutritional reward. It's very expensive for plants to produce things like papayas. And animals such as cedar waxwings here come along, eat the fruit, and then deposit the seeds in a convenient package of fertilizer. Isn't that nice? Play is another type of behavior that's very recognizable as positive for animals. And it's even though it has a frivolous feel to it, it's actually a very important, useful behavior. Play helps an animal develop physical strength and learn the ropes of good social behavior, how to behave the right way in your society, and how to keep fit. It's very useful, very important. Tends to be more common in young animals. They have perhaps more time to play. They know where their next meal is coming from, mom usually, and they also have a lot more to learn. However, animals such as Ben here, a 7-year-old terrier who also knows where his next meal is coming, they will play throughout life. They have the luxury of that. And by the way, there's plenty of examples of adult animals playing in the wild as well, and a growing interest in that from scientists. Anyway, I photographed Ben. I asked 81-year-old Eileen if I could do that, and she said, sure, take some pictures. This was some years ago. And Ben, like most optimistic dogs, when he's playing chase the ball, he's looking at Eileen. He's not looking at the ball. Eileen is the one who's going to throw it. So she's the one he's engaged with. And like any optimistic dog, he's often running before the ball gets out there. You may have seen those mean-spirited people who fake it, and then the dogs. And then he'd come running back, and he's 7, and she's 81. She ran out of energy much sooner than he did. But he would be leaping up and down at her flanks as she walked away to go back to the house. Very joyous, happy dog. Animals love to play. They also love touch. These macaws, for instance, parrots, long-lived social animals, they know each other as individuals. They will alloprene, that is to say, preening another. And it's a way of cementing social bonds, saying, I like you, I'm glad you're here. Why is it powerful for that? Because it feels nice. We all love a massage. And primates also, many species such as baboons spend 20% or more of their daily activity grooming each other, or allogrooming as the term is for mammals, to use the jargon while we're on jargon. Some animals have built-in convenient back scratchers, such as goats. I regularly see them. I volunteer at a local animal sanctuary. I regularly see the goats doing this. Sometimes they'll even lift a leg and they can reach further back. They're quite flexible. And this is a street cat in Utrecht, the Netherlands, a few years ago. A very friendly cat, very trusting, just came right up to me, a complete stranger, and enjoyed a little chin scratch. And I'm sure, based on the hands I saw earlier, a number of people know that feeling. It feels good to give them a scratch under the chin, and they clearly absolutely love it. So touch is a very powerful thing. Sheep on the sanctuary I go to, sometimes I'll rub them, partly to warm my hands if it's winter, because that fleece is pretty thick. And I remember I was doing this with my daughter here some years ago, and then I stopped and I was talking to her, and then I felt this scraping on my boot, and I looked down and the hickory, the sheep, was scraping at my boot, a sheep's way of saying, hey, let's have some more of that, that was good. And the same thing happened to me just a couple of another weeks ago. Another sheep named Chester, I was doing this, rubbing his back, and he was kind of, really seemed to be into it. And I stopped and I walked somewhere else, and then I felt this leg up. And I mention that because it says a lot about their awareness. It's like, this is the guy who just gave me that really nice back rub. Not the person over there, this guy. So the sheep comes over to me and then recognizes me as an autonomous being who can make a decision to do it again, what I was doing, and then asks me in a very, very clear way that I totally understood. Did Chester get some more back rubs? Absolutely. It felt great to do it, and especially when they ask. You know they're enjoying it. A study of surgeonfish at the University of Lisbon found that if the fishes were stressed, I think the way they did that was they put individual fish in tanks and lowered the water level so it was just enough for them for maybe 20 minutes, not very nice. Stresses them out a bit. You can measure the stress by their hormones in the blood. And then they put them in a tank that had a wand. And if the wand was stationary, they spent a lot less time near that wand than if the wand was going like this. If the wand was going like that, the fish, especially the stressed one, would swim up to it and be next to it so they could actually feel it stroking them. So fishes voluntarily go to a wand to get a stroke. Now, why would fish do that? Well, actually, I will get into that in a little bit. I don't think I'm quite there. So I will explain that a little bit more, the background for that behavior. But here's some other examples of touch. An interspecies touch, because touch is so powerful. I mentioned me and the sheep. There's areas of Western India where dogs hang out with langur monkeys. And the monkeys groom them. And what do the dogs do for the monkeys? It's not clear, but chances are it's probably a mutual benefit. A lot of these things are built on a plus-plus relationship where both parties benefit. And the dog benefits from the nice spa treatment and perhaps a few parasites removed. And my guess is the monkeys benefit from perhaps having extra vigilance. Having a carnivore in their midst maybe makes things a little safer for some enemies. Also, better warning. So the dog is able to recognize some sounds of something approaching that the monkeys might not recognize. Chances are there's some benefit there. Plus, monkeys love to groom. They really enjoy picking through fur. And maybe that dog goes to some areas where they pick up some more mites and ticks than the monkeys do. Who knows? It's speculation, but chances are there's a plus-plus relationship in there. Related, albeit rather bizarre, another carnivore, essentially, and non-carnivore, herbivore relationship. In parts of Uganda, it's been noticed that warthogs have learned to go and flop down as an invitation gesture near banded mongoose colonies so they can get a nice spa treatment themselves. The mongooses love it. They come running along. They swarm over these warthogs, and they remove parasites and sloughing skin and that sort of thing. So the mongooses get a few little treats, and the warthog, as you can see from this slide, is quite happy to cooperate and be involved in that. Yet another example involving hippos and fish. There was a nice article in National Geographic maybe 15 years ago showing this area of Kenya where these hippos are out on the land at night, and then they go into these cool springs, freshwater springs in the day, and then there they enjoy a spa treatment. Fishes of various species swim over to them and proceed to remove vegetation from between their splayed toes. The hippos are very cooperative. They spread their legs apart to give the fish maximum access to all nooks and crannies, and they open their mouths, and they never bite the fish. You don't diss or bite or harm or kill your business partner, and they don't do that. So they're very happy. Sometimes they'll drift off into a blissful sleep based on this nice, delicate touch. And fish do it, and this explains what I said earlier about the surgeonfish, I think. The reason surgeonfishes like that stroking is because they're reef fishes, and they're probably familiar with this touch, which they get from cleaner fish. Cleaner-client mutualisms are widespread, particularly in reefs, but some other habitats, and they involve fishes, literally, I am not making this up, lining up to wait their turn to be serviced by cleaner fish. Cleaner fish will often work individually, but more often they work in teams. This photo, which was not my photo, was actually published in my book, The Exultant Ark, before I actually noticed that there's actually a second cleaner fish up here. So they're working in pairs, these two. This is I think probably the blue-striped cleaner wrasse. There's some other species that do this. Essentially, they open for business. They swim in a certain way, essentially like the barbershop signs swirling around, advertising they're open for business. And then the fish line up and come along, and they hover there in the area where these fish ply their trade, and then they get plucked over. The cleaner fish remove parasites, very important in some areas. Parasite loads can increase rapidly. There's a lot of parasites in marine environments. and sloughing skin and algae and other unwanteds for the fish's perspective. So the cleaners get food, and by the way, they service thousands, sometimes thousands of clients a day. And it is like a business relationship. The client fish, in this case a map puffer fish, will open the mouth and the cleaners will swim into the mouth. The client never eats them. And then they may swim in and out of the gills where parasites often lodge themselves, and they'll pluck those off and they'll remove that. So the client fish gets this nice spa treatment, and the cleaners get some food, cumulatively food over the course of the day. It's complicated. It gets Machiavellian. Some fishes mimic cleaner fishes. They look like them, and they start out nicely, and then they nip off a piece of fin and quickly swim away. And the client's really pissed off, if you'll pardon the expression. Swims after them, tries to catch them. And probably because there are cheaters and deceivers out there. It's the same in any society. It doesn't pay to deceive doesn't pay to, forget that part of it. Basically, there are cheaters and there are people who commit crimes. Most of us are honest most of the time. But because of that, other clients are carefully watching these interactions. They want to see who's a good cleaner, who's not so good. And the cleaner fishes have been shown to perform much better services if they know they're being watched. That's called an audience effect. And that's been shown in these fishes. And cleaners will go even further. If they're being watched, they'll spend more time doing a little flutter with the fins. They're not even plucking anything off. They're just sort of I'm giving you a little extra massage just to show you how darn good I am. Come on, let's have the next client. So it's really intriguing, a very complex interaction that's going on here. And there's new studies coming out on this all the time that show really interesting nuances of the behavior. And perhaps not surprisingly, because some fishes do like to be stroked and petted, there are fish like Larry here. He's a Bahamian, well, he's also Bahamian. A Bahamian, slip of the tongue, a Bahamian grouper who comes to be petted by divers. This is in an area where there's no spearfishing allowed, so he's trusting of humans. And he's a personality. He's a long-lived fish, and he cares, and he likes pleasure, and he enjoys that. And we like stroking them. It's kind of like when we're petting the cat on the sidewalk. The power of touch extends into the power of love. And you won't find the word love in the index of most animal behavior texts, but we should expect love to evolve in species such as giraffes, where the parents work together to raise their young successfully. Young who will contain the genes for caring and loving behavior. And then there's courtship. Speaking of investments, this is like the animal version of those fruit that the trees provide in a way. It's very expensive for a peacock to produce these colors and these bright feathers. It's costly. It makes them harder they attract more predators, harder to get away from them. And yet it happens. Why? Because females have been choosy in this species for a long time. And millennia of female peahens being picky and saying, I prefer the ones with the slightly bigger tail. They have generally driven the evolution of extravagant showiness in animals. I don't mean to sound misogynistic with that. That wasn't intended. And speaking of courtship, back to fish. This will be in my book, believe it or not. It was a mystery as to how these 8-foot wide mandala-like structures were being produced off the coast of Japan. And then a photographer a few years ago set up a camera and found out what was going on. A little pufferfish, a male pufferfish, you can figure the motive here, was spending a lot of time, many hours, creating these beautiful Mandela-like structures. Why? To attract a female. And I want to say it's a complete coincidence that my entry into the dessert contest in my work a few years ago looked so much like one of these. That is the best vegan cheesecake you will ever have. Actually, the best cheesecake, but my opinion. All right, I had to warn you. I was talking about pleasure. It's important to have at least one sex slide, so if you're a little shy, just shy your eyes. But we often don't think about sex as a source of pleasure for animals. We really should. They may not always be having sex year-round. Neither am I sometimes. But they're very motivated. They're very motivated and into it when they have it, as am I. So there's my sex slide. Moving on. Do animals have a sense of humor? Do they tell jokes? In my book, Pleasurable Kingdom, I've given a few examples, anecdotes of gorillas telling jokes, actually wordplay, puns. If these animals have learned language through sign language, they can really create some creative ways of using language. And you can see lots of examples of sort of animal humor and animal play on YouTube. It's a bit of a fine line between play and humor. I think if an animal has the capacity to play, I think there's the germ of humor in there as well. For example, rats, a series of fascinating studies by an American neuroscientist named Jaak Panksepp, who's on our editorial board of our journal Animal Sentience. He did a series of fascinating studies showing that rats love to be tickled. That if you take them when they're young and get them used to being flipped on their back and tickled, they'll run to the hand. And again, you can see YouTube videos for this. By the way, the visuals we've seen this morning and before my talk are just stunning, what you put together. Really, everyone does need a box of tissues. Anyway, you can watch YouTube videos, and that's really powerful. We can see YouTube videos to see these phenomena. And, you know, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Well, I'd say a video is worth 1,000 pictures. Really conveys animal behavior in a way that no amount of speaking can do. Anyway, rats who are trained to expect to be tickled on the nape or just a little petting on the nape will come to the hand for more of that. But rats who are expecting to be flipped onto their back and tickled in the belly, which, by the way, they do to each other when they're young, it's part of their play behavior, they will run to the hand 4 times as quickly. Scientists like to measure things. They will run to the hand 4 times as quickly as rats who are merely expecting to be petted. And they will make 7 times as many, on average, 7 times as many ultrasonic chirps in the 50 kilohertz range. That's basically a very happy, kind of almost like a laughing, very positive affect sound that rats will make. If it's a 22 kilohertz chirp, that's a negative affect. They're not very happy with that. They do that in negative situations. So you have a nice paradigm for measuring positive and negative affect in rats. 7 times as many positive chirps as for rats being tickled than rats who are merely getting a stroke on the neck. The rats like a stroke on the neck too, but not nearly as much as this. Comfort. Comfort. We can all relate to comfort. We're cold, we like to get warm. If we're hot, we like to get cool. And ringtail lemurs are a good example. They will sun. Many animals will sun, and many animals will go for a warm surface if it's cold, and vice versa. And bricks are a nice source of a warm surface sometimes. And one last concept relating to pleasure is an ineffable one, really. The animal probably doesn't think about it, but it's so important. Freedom. The ability to make choices about what you do and to have space to do it. And I think that's a really important concept. Any conference about animals needs to mention freedom, and that's why I'm mentioning it, because freedom, the flip side of which, of course, is confinement. Confinement comes up a lot in the discourse at such meetings, but freedom, the flip side of that, is a really important concept to understand. I included this photo of this fox in my book, The Exultant Ark, for the very reason that it, to me, conveys the positive nature of freedom, of being free, being autonomous. Okay, got a little time left. I want to talk a little bit about society and virtue in animals, an interesting, relatively new frontier of the study of animal behavior. Virtue is not something we really associate with animals, but let me talk a bit about that. A lot of animals are social. They live in groups. They benefit from living in groups. Wood swallows in Australia, for example, they like to huddle together. It may help them keep warm when it's cold, but also it may be a way of having information exchanged among individuals. Younger, naive individuals who don't know where to find their food can learn from older ones. Same with the Mexican free-tailed bats, which live in these huge colonies. Why live in these huge colonies? You've got to compete with each other for food, and yet they do. And they may fly 60 miles from the cave each night to get food. And the young ones probably don't know where the best places are to fly, so they probably listen to other bats. So it's actually, there's a term for that. The jargon, the scientific jargon, poikilothermic over there, is information center hypothesis. These young lions, the photographer who I know, when she saw them, she said they were looking at some older male lions, couple of big males who were wandering around. It made them really nervous, these young ones. They immediately huddled together and were rubbing against each other, basically feeling more at home and more comfortable because they're in a group. I think most of us can relate to that. If we're walking down a street in the dark and we're with friends, we feel a lot more secure than if we're by ourselves. And social animals know each other as individuals. Individuality, very important concept in animals. It's not just dolphins or lions, it's those particular individuals. And dolphins, they don't name each other Nancy or Kyle, but they do have signature whistles that are distinctive to them. And they will not only use their own signature whistle, but they will use another one, so they can make a note to somebody else and get someone else's attention in the pod. And There's yet to be a study of social behavior in fishes that failed to find individual recognition in fishes. So not only are these beautifully named diagonally banded sweetlips, don't you love that name, diagonally banded sweetlips? I like to say it at least twice because it's such a great name. Not only do they look cute and lovely, but they probably all know each other as individuals. They look pretty much the same to us, but all animals are individuals, and they're tuned into their own individuality more than we are. So they know each other. And there's no reason why these friendships and connections can't form across species as well that I was referring to earlier. So society, as we saw some of those examples in touch, it crosses species lines. Animals are no more racist than most of us are today in this day and age. A society, as I said, can lead to virtue. It behooves us to do good to others. And the most extreme examples really are in the eusocial insects, such as termites and ants, who are actually more closely related genetically to each other, and so through evolutionary time, they've evolved behaviors that are very self-sacrificial. And there's also some interesting interspecies relationships, such as the relationship between ants and aphids. This is another mutualism where ants police, if you like. They're like a police force for the aphids. They protect them because aphids are rather defenseless. And in return, aphids give them honey, essentially. It's called a honeydew. It's a droplet, sweet droplets that they push out through their rear ends, and the ants nibble them up and very happy with that. So everybody's happy about that arrangement. In vertebrates, we find parent-offspring relationships, which are very compelling in terms of benefits, mutual benefits. It is costly for parents to feed their young, but of course the young have their genes, and so from an evolutionary genetic perspective, very beneficial to them. Now here's a parent on the left is a parent oyster catcher feeding his or her young, which you can tell because of the different feather pattern indicates a young one. The young one needs to learn how to forage, and there's a lot of teaching and learning in animal behavior as well. A study of vampire bats found that they will return favors from others. It's called reciprocal altruism. And a university professor from the University of Maryland had the unenviable task of lying face up in a tree hollow, looking at vampire bats for a few months. They were tagged, and he had a light, and was the first to document what's called reciprocal altruism, a theory that had been around for a few years. And what happens is sometimes a vampire bat may be ill or giving birth, a female, unable to fly out and get a blood meal. And instead, another bat may come back from the colony and will feed blood to them. Sounds a little gross to us, regurgitating blood. Hope you're enjoying your lunch. But it's actually a very pretty generous behavior. And what he showed was bats who received a blood meal from another bat were much more likely to return the favor at a later date if there was a call for it. So that's what's the reciprocal part of the reciprocal altruism. Lastly, prairie dogs, they have a lot of enemies out there in the fields: dogs, coyotes, aerial predators, eagles, hawks, humans, ferrets, snakes. They have a rich vocabulary. There's a great book called Chasing Dr. Dolittle by a colleague of mine, Consul Bojikov, who took this photograph, and he's also on our editorial board at Animal Sentience, I'm proud to say. Anyway, great book, and he's sticking his neck out because he's arguing that animals don't merely communicate, they have language. They have semantic language, and this is his prime example. They have over 100 words, if you like, prairie dogs. And not only that, but if you subject them to new stimuli, such as a human who walks through with a shotgun and discharges the shotgun into the ground near the colony benignly, say 5 days in a row, by day 5, they have a new call for that particular human, man with shotgun. They don't say man with shotgun, but their squeak is modified. They also modify their squeaks for different colors. Don't ask me why, it's not really being explained, but they do that. It's very, very consistent. How do you learn that? Well, you record these squeaks, and then you give these alarm calls when there's no predator present, and you see how they behave. And you can see they behave very appropriately. So if it's a call for a dog, a domestic dog, they kind of just hang out. They're alert. But if it's a coyote, they're a little trickier. You better go to the burrow, but you don't have to go down the burrow. But if it's aerial predator, eagle or hawk, go straight down to the nearest burrow. Don't ask questions because they're stealth predators and they're fast and they're very dangerous. So they have different reactions, appropriate reactions to different threats. And it feels good to be nice. We know that. It feels good to do a deed. We even have the aphorism, is better to give than to receive. And this is the primate version, allo grooming, and here's the bird version. Exactly the same behavior, just sort of doing a good deed. You think these 3 birds know each other? Absolutely, they know each other. And they'll know each other next week, and they did last week. This really surprised me, a recent study finding It documented 18 adoptions in the wild, meaning an infant who lost a parent, lost the mother, was adopted. 18 cases. You might expect that 18 of them, if you've read any of Jane Goodall's work on chimpanzees, that 18 of the 18 would be females who adopted. But it actually was 9 and 9. 9 of the adopters were males. So these were male chimps who were making a major personal sacrifice in an investment in a young one. Very surprising. And then we have people who are doing good deeds for animals, and this is very apropos to the meeting here. This is one of many people who are now working to try and turn things around for sharks, terribly misunderstood, so beleaguered, in particular by the shark fin trade, that their populations have been declining. Many of them are endangered now, and just very poorly the conditions that's going on. I mean, the whole shark fin trade is just grotesquely cruel as well. Well, Cristina Zanotto is an example of a diver. She dives down with them, and then she uses touch, and this links back to animal pleasure. She uses touch. She strokes the sharks, and she sends them into sort of a state of euphoria, where they become so relaxed she can literally pick them up and flip them upside down and balance them on her hand. They're just really basically chilled out. And then in that state, she's able to remove fishing hooks from their mouths. They often get caught by fishermen, and the fishermen will cut the line rather than have to deal with a shark, and the shark goes swimming off with a nasty hook buried in his mouth, and she's able to take those out. The sharks often flinch. They may even swim away, but they'll come back to her because they know she's a good one, she's going to help me, and it works, and everybody benefits. Well, they certainly do. And for those who are really courageous, like me, you can do bee rescues. Sometimes I'm walking along after a rain and there's a bumblebee or a honeybee who's been downed by the rain. They're still alive, but they're cold. They may not recover. Just pick them up. I've never had one sting me. They seem to know you're trying to help them. You let them crawl on your hand. I take them back, put a little sugar water on a Q-tip, feed it to the bee. Usually the bee immediately tastes it and the tongue comes out. You can probably see the tongue there in the middle. And they have a little meal, they refuel, they know how to find their way to the colony, have superb spatial memory and direction, so they'll fly back to their colony, and I get to feel good saving a bee. So in sum, animals are like us, they're pleasure seekers. We're not just pain avoiders, we're not just trying to avoid the bad stuff, we're looking for the pleasures in life. That's kind of gives life meaning, or a lot of meaning. And they're individuals. They're unique personalities with preferences as well. And I think it would behoove us, I think it does behoove us, and this is very much part of the theme of the conference, really to practice empathy, to put ourselves in their position. And I don't know what life's like for a ringneck snake. It's probably experientially somewhat different than my life, but it's a life. This is an animal with a full set of senses, a brain, cognition, I would argue emotions. The emerging studies of reptiles would say this is an animal that knows fear, this is an animal that probably knows pleasure. And so this animal has a life, has intrinsic value worth something to the animal and not just to us. And so it's an animal who deserves our respect and consideration. And we need to recognize that while we may characterize and categorize these two animals very differently in our society, and different societies around the world classify dogs and cattle, for instance, very differently. Nevertheless, in all the important ways, their capacity to feel and think, to experience, really the word is feel, is essentially the same as each other, and I would argue the same as ours. And for that reason, we really need a rapidly evolving ethic. We can do much better by animals, and we are beginning to move that way. There's a lot of work to do, and thank goodness for people like you here to do that. And I'm just going to finish on the concept of karma, which I love the concept, what's good for one is good for the other. When we're good to others, it comes back to us. And being good to animals is not just about the animals. It's also being good to ourselves and making a better society. I'll close with that. Thank you very much.
I personally am so happy to report that this will be my last time at this microphone, and my MC duties are over and I can now really relax. I have some announcements briefly. I want to let you know that the governor of the state of Oklahoma, and I'll quote her, says, now therefore, I, Mary Fallon, Governor of the state of Oklahoma, do hereby proclaim March 30th, 2015 as Animal Wellbeing Awareness Day for the whole state. So